just blew me away. What was going on in behind closed doors? The collusion, the corruption, the scams, the lies, the deceit. You couldn't believe it. But it was in writing and they admitted it. But they never admitted it to the public, but to themselves. They kept everything a secret except amongst themselves.
Welcome to the Tom Nelson Podcast. I have Dale Johnson here today. And Dale, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I've been an analyst for quite a few years. I worked for Northern Telecom, and then it became Nortel Networks as an analyst for their wireless equipment division. After they closed up business, I worked for a municipality in analysis of water and wastewater treatment. And since then, I left that about 15 years ago. I've just been doing a bunch of different jobs.
One thing that interests me a lot about you is how you've dove in so far on the ClimateGate emails. Do you want to talk about how much time you've put into it?
Well, I first heard about it. I didn't know anything about the ClimateGate when it first came out. I was one of those that was scared of the AIDS crisis. I thought I was going to get AIDS back in the 80s. Yeah. Then I believed in the ozone hole. I was going to get skin cancer. And then Y2K, I thought the whole world was going to collapse. It didn't. And when I was working for the municipality, there was in the news, it was about the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009. And just before that opened up, in the news, it was about the ClimateGate emails. And I had some spare time. So just curious, I've always done a lot of reading and research. So I downloaded the miles just for shits and giggles. Wanted to see what was going on. Anyways, I started reading, didn't think I'd find anything. I saw some snippets in the news and wondered, if it's true, like what's the context? Are these taken out of context? Are they made up? That kind of stuff. Anyway, so I started reading and there was about 1,000 links. And I didn't stop reading for a few weeks. Like it was like a mystery novel. You didn't know what you were going to find in the next one. Some of the links didn't have much information on it. They had personal information. Other ones, there was back and forth, 5, 6, 7 emails in a chain together. And it was just fascinating looking at the inside of climate science. Probably one of the premier climate science institutes in the world. What was going on behind the scenes? Nobody knew. Everything that they told in public, they were telling the exact opposite to themselves. It was hard to believe. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was a mystery novel, but it was almost unbelievable how much was involved.
Yeah, your experience was pretty similar to mine, I think, in reading the emails. I was kind of doing the same thing at the same time. But had you been a skeptic at all or been into the climate debate much at all before ClimateGate?
No, I had ignored it. I really didn't pay attention to it. I was busy with work. I was on call 24 hours a day. I really didn't care, but I heard a little bit about it, and then I decided to read it. And I didn't stop reading. And then when the ClimateGate 2.0 came out, it took me a little while. I go, all right, let's see what's in that one. And so 5,300 links. I decided to read it. I did not get bored. It took months of reading it. And again, it just blew me away of what was going on in behind closed doors, the collusion, the corruption, the scams, the lies, the deceit. It was just, you couldn't believe it. But it was in writing and they admitted it. But they never admitted it to the public, but to themselves. They kept everything a secret except amongst themselves.
So were you following people discussing this on What's Up With That and other blogs, or were you mostly just reading on your own?
Just reading on my own. I wasn't familiar with any of the names, the characters involved. Michael Mann didn't mean anything to me. Phil Jones didn't mean anything to me. I had no idea who these people were, but it didn't take long to find out who they were. They put it in their own words.
So were you blogging at all about this, or Twitter? I don't know. You weren't on Twitter yet then, or?
No, I wasn't on Twitter. I wasn't blogging. I wasn't doing anything. Just researching, getting my own information. And then a few years ago, I decided to go on Twitter, and I came across a thread. I believe it was started by Patrick Morse years ago, and I somehow got into that, and I go, maybe I could use what I've found in the ClimateGate emails and promote the truth.
And how did that go?
I was attacked viciously. Like there was no tolerance for. It doesn't matter what you say, what you do. Like I tried first using skeptics, Tony Heller, Climate Audit, Steve McIntyre,
Yes.
Patrick Moore, but anybody that's involved in the climate cult, they will not accept anything from the experts. It doesn't matter. You can have the same degrees, you can have higher degrees. If you're a skeptic, a denier, or like Michael Mann calls baddies, they don't accept it. So I go, okay, I know enough from the emails of the characters involved, hundreds of them. I'm going to use that information and put that forward, and then they have to either attack me or attack their own. And the mental gymnastics that they have to go through is just bizarre. Like they can see it, they can read it, but their mind will not absorb it. They will not acknowledge that these are coming from Hansen. They're coming from Stefan Ram. They're coming from Michael Mann. They're coming from Tim Osborne. They're coming from Jill Jones. They're coming from Kevin Trenberth. They just don't accept it. It's in writing, but they won't acknowledge it. Their mind, their brains are turned off. Like their eyes wide shut applies perfectly to them.
Yeah, I think that's been my experience too, that when people are really in on it, it seems like it's very hard to convince them. But do you think you were convincing people off on the side, people who weren't convinced either way? But that's my hope, that other people were reading, and I bet you were convincing people who weren't dug in yet.
I believe so, and I think it's an education of even the people that know what's going on, helping fortify and support them and providing them information that they can use to support their arguments. Like you can't go any more than straight from the horse's mouth. You can't get any information better than what they say about it.
And you said you kept a lot of handwritten notes, right? Did you keep many, like hundreds of pages of handwritten notes as you went through the emails, or how'd you keep track of what you had already learned?
I didn't at the beginning. I just read them. But as I got more involved in it, I decided to start making infographics. Some people call them memes.
Yeah.
I make infographics of exact quotes, put the source on it, so people can validate and verify it. I won't take anything out of context. If anybody has followed me since I started, I can validate everything that I post. There's nothing out of context. The context may not be there, but the context doesn't change the meaning of what they said. It just rationalizes and explains why they said it and why they meant it.
Yeah, so you'd put out like a picture and you'd have the ClimateGate email number on there, right? The quote and the number, something like that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And now that website has gone down for some reason, but you can still access it through the Wayback Machine. So everything's still available. It might take a few seconds longer to find it, but everything's still there. 5,300 some links. And I'm guessing about 3 emails back and forth in each one. So there's over 15,000. And this is there's another 220,000 links
Yes.
to emails that have never, ever been published. I don't think they ever will, but there's enough in these that destroys the cult, the climate cult.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Did you end up reading any books about ClimateGate or watch the movie that had Phil Jones in it, anything like that in modern times?
No, I read the ClimateGate emails, and then because of the characters involved, I decided to do some research on some of the characters, in listening to some of their YouTube interviews, reading their blogs, newspaper articles, magazine interviews that they were in, and it's more information on there because some of them, they don't expect to be challenged. Nobody goes, that doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? And they get the white glove treatment, the red carpet treatment, and anything they say is valid to the interviewer, but it doesn't make sense to anybody else.
Okay. So you were putting up these memes on Twitter under an account that's defunct now? Or what account did you use then?
First off, I used BLAUBOK, but then that got suspended pretty quick after I had 28,000 followers.
Really?
It was in the Trump heyday and through the 2016, and everybody was signing up. That got suspended because I guess I was a little bit too abrupt. And so then I started another one, and I'm working now with a Filipina. She's a computer graphics, and we use the name Dawn. It's not her real name. We're doing that to protect her identity. She has been stalked. She is being stalked by some of the climate cultists, and she doesn't want to get involved. She's innocent. Graphic arts is her specialty. I do a lot of the research and help her with that. And then we use a guy that has a comedic background out of Vancouver. He gives advice on some of the more comedic aspects. He's done stand-up, he's done cartoons, things like that. So it's a collaborative effort. I've probably done most of the research, and I help her with the infographics.
That's a pretty well-known account, right? I think people are going to enjoy seeing this in the show description. I'll put the name of the account there, right? So people can go ahead and check it out. Yeah, a lot of good stuff out there.
When the inquiries happened, I think there was 7 or 8 of them happened after the first ClimateGate was put online, leaked online. I thought something was going to happen in the investigations because it's in writing. Deleting emails, telling people to delete emails, which was completely illegal, but none of the inquiries asked for any other emails. They dealt with those 1,000 links, and that was it. They whitewashed it. They said, oh, okay, the Freedom of Information Act, it was contravened, but the 6-month statute of limitations, that was it. End of show. Everybody can go home. And when the 5,000 were leaked online several years later, like 2 years later, nobody said anything. It was quiet.
Did you see any official investigation that looked like the people even read the emails? I didn't see any indication that they read the emails.
No. When they were investigating, they didn't ask for any more emails.
Right, yeah.
And there was articles out within a day or two of those 5,000 links out saying there's nothing new here, there's nothing to see. And I go, how can you read 5,000 links in a few hours? It doesn't make sense. It took me 6 months to go through it and kind of scan through them and make some infographics and things like that. When I started to get more serious on it, I took a book and there's pages and pages. Every single email, every single link, I made crib notes as to what the main thing is. But there's so much in some of those emails, like you could write a 26-volume encyclopedia set. The things that happened are so strange, and some of them are extremely hilarious. You could do stand-up comedy, you could do a sitcom, and you wouldn't have to ad-lib much. They make fools of themselves just by what they tell each other. The first thing that really struck me was the freedom of information. The people at Climate Research Unit at University of Anglia, they were the epicenter of ClimateGate. They bent over backwards trying to avoid the freedom of information requests. They would get a list from David Palmer, who is the information guru, and he would go, okay, these are the only reasons we can not comply with the FOI requests. And so they would go through the list and they try to come up with something that might be pertinent so they wouldn't have to comply. But Phil Jones got into trouble because he stopped sending the information. So he dug his own hole. And when he wouldn't send the data, wouldn't release the data, he said, I spent 25 years doing this. I'm not going to give you the data. You're going to find something wrong with it. It's like, he says, I'd rather delete the data than give it to you. So he had an agenda to keep things secret. He started deleting emails, and he told David Palmer that I'm deleting emails. He goes, no. Palmer writes back, and he says, you can't delete emails, but because of the FOI request, you have to say that you're doing it as part of your routine maintenance of your database. So he goes, oh yeah, that's what I was doing as part of my routine maintenance.
But this is all in writing in the ClimateGate emails. Him admitting that he's deleting it.
Yeah, and they're telling each other to delete emails, anything involved with IPCC, because they were requesting that information. They said, as soon as we're finished our work with the IPC, delete everything you got. Got to have nothing left. And it's all in writing. They can't deny it. Nobody has ever proven that any of the emails were out of context or that they were fabricated, falsified in any way. You have to take it at their word.
I do enjoy the gymnastics over Mike's nature trick. They're trying to make us think that was no big deal, but I think that was critical. Yeah.
Yeah, Phil Jones coined the term Mike's nature trick because he used it himself. But there were several deceptive aspects to that other than just the hockey stick blade.
Yep.
They wanted to remove the variability, so they made the stick flat.
Yes.
And if we did that up here in Whitehorse, Yukon, our average temperature is -1 degree Celsius, like 30 degrees Fahrenheit. If you average that out over 100 years or 1,000 years, it's below zero. But every year, our temperatures vary from -42, -45 degrees, up to 90, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, -40 Celsius to 35, plus 35 Celsius. So there's the variability is removed when you smooth it. And they played with different smoothing, 50 year, 100 year. Mike, when his methodology came out, and it didn't give him the results he wanted, what he did, because when they came to certain tree rings, instead of warming like the observations were, it showed a decrease in temperature. He goes, well, that's no good. So he took a chainsaw and amputated it. And then he took the observations and then hacked and sewed it on to his smooth graph. And it looked like it was a huge increase in temperatures, and it wasn't. But the IPCC took that, ran with it, and Hans von Storch is one of the honest guys in the alarmist camp. He berated the IPCC for not challenging it. Nobody said that this was different than all the other papers. It was different than the consensus up to that point. But nobody challenged it. Nobody says you have to prove the others wrong before you can show that yours right. And he didn't. Everybody just jumped on the bandwagon and said, we're in for hell on earth. It's going to be like Venus. And it's not. It was all a scam. But he wasn't the only one. Phil Jones coined the term. Keith Briffa, he had the Briffa Bodge, and he did it different. Jones would take the results they didn't like, cut them off, and then add what they wanted. But Keith Briffa goes, that's too hard. He says, I'm just going to inflate the numbers that are there, and then we'll get the rise that matches Michael Mann. Tim Osborne, he did exactly the same thing. He did what Michael Mann did. He chopped off from 1960 or so because of hiding the decline. Even though he said it's not a good thing, he advised people to do it. He said, you got to cut off from 1960 because of the decline. And so he did the same thing. And he implicated Tom Crowley and Lowry. I don't remember what his first name was, also doing the same thing. So there's at least 7 of them that did exactly the same thing. They hid the decline. They used smoothing to reduce the variability, so it looked like everything was stable, and it wasn't stable.
And then there was also a discussion of the 1940s warm period, right? About removing the blip, or why the blip. Do you remember that?
Yeah, thing they disagreed with, they had to get rid of. First, it was the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age. And then they came across some inconvenient sea surface temperature data, 1940s, and they came up with a lot of different reasons or different rationalizations how to get rid of that. We got to remove this blip, and he chose, I forget the character's name, but he chose a specific parameter to put in to remove it. And he says, if we do this to land, we do this to sea, but we still have a blip, so how do we explain it? And they wanted to get rid of it. And the sea surface temperatures, which they were talking about, were the most critical part of a global average temperature. It's 71% of the Earth. And Phil Jones said that the sea surface temperatures, the ships, they're not designed for climate sensitivity. You can't take a moving thing going across the ocean and find out what the climate's doing. You're in a different place every day. And there was enough, the temperatures themselves were sketchy enough. If there was a storm going, people aren't going to go out on the deck and throw a bucket overboard. So they just copied down what somebody had written before, maybe changed it a little bit. They came up with probably a dozen different ways where they could adjust the sea surface temperatures. The type of buckets, canvas, wood, double insulated, whether it was an engine intake. Then they came up with more ways they could adjust sea surface temperatures, whether the ship was laden or whether it was empty, the speed they were going. They used that. And anytime you want to adjust sea surface temperatures, you can make up a reason to go back and do it, which is what, and then the buoys came in the late, I guess, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. The electronic, Argo buoys came in. Well, that created a problem because it showed, well, some of the emails say that the buoys were biased warm. Most of them said that they were biased cold. And so the hiatus was a huge problem. The cooling from 1998 actually is kind of pretty flat. Yeah. And so what Tom Carl did on his own, he got a few of his other comrades at NOAA together, and they adjusted the Argo buoys. Even though they were high-tech, the latest technology, and comparing them to the buoys, which is dodgy as all get out. People reading with a flashlight in the dark as to what a thermometer said, but they took the high-tech buoys, the Argo buoys, electronic readings, and they go, they're too cold, we got to warm them up. And it didn't make sense. Why would you adjust high-tech to the old tech? It didn't make sense. So I actually wrote them. He was gone by then, but I did email the first co-author. It wasn't the lead author, and I said, what's going on? I said, that doesn't really make sense. Why did you adjust the high-tech temperatures to match what you thought was in the buckets? And he goes, well, he says it doesn't really matter. And I go, yeah, it does. It matters a lot. And I explained it to him, how you can take hands of a clock and you move them one direction or the other direction to show an increase. And I said, you're making an increase. And I said, if you would have done it the other way, it would have shown a decrease. So he said, so he replied back and he said, it really didn't matter. So I made the point that it matters. Which ones you adjust. And he said, well, it doesn't really matter. But he says, I didn't do the calculations. Here's the guy that worked with us. He did the calculation. So I emailed him. His name was Huang. Huang. And he said, it's just the way they came up with it in a meeting. They said, oh, hey, let's adjust the high-tech stuff to the old, outdated, obsolete methodology. And he said, and it really doesn't matter because, and that was known as the hiatus buster. Oh. They did it without going through the hierarchy. They did it on their own, but they attached NOAA's name on it, and they got scolded for doing that. But Huang wrote me back in an email, and he said, it's all behind us now because he said 2 years later, we did another adjustment, and we reversed what we did before. Okay. So they cooled the Argo buoys, and then 2 years later they go, nope, let's raise them back up again. So they can rationalize an adjustment, and then they can rationalize unrationalizing that adjustment and reverse it. That's the climate science.
Yeah, so the farcical handling of data all over the place, that jumped out at me from the ClimateGate emails. With Phil Jones talking about, I don't know if he used the term ad hoc, about how he would get data from maybe Antarctica or some places, and he wouldn't know where the raw data was anymore, and I don't think he even knew if it had already been homogenized or not, and it was just a hodgepodge, it looked like to me, with no real control.
Yeah, he talked with a Canadian mission, and he says, talking to the Canadian in the email, he says, we've got the data and the adjustments we've made, and then you've got your adjustments to the data you've made, and then we've got this other stuff. We don't know what adjustments are made, who made them, why they made them, but he said, we're just going to run with it. There's nothing robust in any of the temperature data. Phil Jones said, he says, we've got temperature for France, but he says it's different than the data that France has for France. How does that make sense to anybody?
Yeah, it does.
And that's climate science.
It is. Do you have any comments on what they were writing about the Harry README file? I think that was pretty funny.
Yeah, I can pull some of them up.
Yeah,
Harry README file, he was the programmer that was tasked with trying to make sense of the data. And he could have been a comic.
Yes.
What he was writing. There were a lot of times where I was reading what he was saying, and I was crying, laughing so hard. Here, I'll just read a few of them.
Sure.
His exact words. I'm seriously close to giving up again. The history of this is so complex that I can't get far enough into it before my head hurts and I have to stop. Each parameter has a tortuous history of manual and semi-automated interventions. I simply can't just go back to the earlier versions. Excuse the swear words, but this is exactly what he said. He goes, oh, fuck this. It's Sunday evening. I've worked all weekend. just when I thought I was done, hitting on another problem that's based on a hopeless state of our databases. There's no uniform data integrity. It's just a catalog of issues that continues to grow as they're found. Although I'm thrilled at the high match rate, he was proud that he got an 87% match rate. He says, it does seem a little bit worse when you realize everything else was lost.
That is worse.
He says, it's evident that the data haven't only been swapped, but they've been scaled too. And then he makes another expletive. He goes on to say, you can't imagine what this cost me to actually follow the operator to assign false World Meteorological Organization codes. But what else is there in such situations? Especially dealing with a master database of dubious provenance, or which they all and always will be. Here's another one. What the hell is supposed to happen here? Oh yeah, there is no supposed to. I can make it up, so I have. And then he puts a smiley face. He tries to make sense of it. He goes, it will allow bad databases to go unnoticed, good databases to become bad, but I really don't think people care enough to fix them. And that's the main reason the project is nearly a year late. There's absolutely no station identification information apart from the World Meteorological Organization code, none. No latitude, no longitude, no name, no country. The data must simply be added to whatever station has the same number at the start. There's no way to check it if it's right. I'm getting seriously fed up with the state of Australian data. So many new stations have been introduced, so many false references, so many changes that aren't documented. He goes, I'm very sorry to report that the rest of the databases seem to be nearly as poor state of Australia was. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of pairs of dummy stations. He goes, okay, how do those first two columns, and he's talking to himself, but he's documenting what he's looking at. Do they look like latitude and longitude to you? Me neither. In fact, the two columns never get outside the plus or minus 30. Oh, bugger, what the hell is going on here? Another one. So what in tarnation is going on? Just how off beam are these data sets? I got more results when I used an elimination radius. Knowing what takes to debug this suite, this experiment ended here. The option, like all the other options, is totally undocumented. We'll never know what we lost. And that's the database that's telling us we're headed to Venus.
Yeah, we're going to spend $40 trillion based on this data. Very amazing.
And we're going to eat bugs.
And bugs.
His actual name is Ian Harris, and he has mentioned a few times when the climate scientists wanted to run some data, they didn't do it themselves. They had him do it. He was their gopher. He brought the donuts, he brought the coffee, he brought the data.
Okay. So in the big picture, do you have any ideas on how this happened, how ClimateGate itself happened, who did it? Were they packaging up this stuff for FOIA and then somebody released this package later, or what happened here?
Nobody really knows who did it. The person has never admitted to doing it, but they had to have known what was going on the inside and the refusals to deal with the Freedom of Information Act, because that's what the file was named, Freedom of Information Act in 2009. So he knew what was going on, and how he got into it, I don't know. He must have been on the inside somehow as a contractor or some other involvement on the inside at Climatic Research Unit in England, because he knew what was going on. The first emails that came out, he just did a few word searches, downloaded it, and was done. And I think he took all 220-some thousand emails at that time. But he only released the first one. Nothing happened, and then a couple of years later, he released the second batch.
Interesting.
I don't know if you know Stephen Mosher at all. He used to work with Berkeley Earth. And people were saying, and he's a climate alarmist, and he's an extremely obnoxious type of person.
Yeah.
He wrote a book, co-authored a book, and he said the snippets themselves weren't out of context. He said if you read the context, they're actually worse than that. But he never ever touched on the databases. Never. He never questioned them, even though it was in writing how corrupted the databases were, how dodgy and sketchy they were. He never mentioned it. He was just on the Freedom of Information Act and the 6 main characters that were involved, and that was it. And he worked at Berkeley Earth with Richard Muller, who was one of the probably the first alarmist that came out and just trashed Michael Mann. Michael Mann didn't take that too kindly to it, and neither did Michael Mann's colleagues. It's funny, they would criticize Michael Mann to each other, but when it came in the public, They rounded the horses, they closed the gates, and then they just started the artillery. They just went crazy trying to demonize whoever dared question Michael Mann, even though they had questions about Michael Mann's work. And it came out slowly that all Michael Mann's tricks, everything he said was a lie. McIntyre's work was all wrong because it was on a spreadsheet, and he blamed his assistant for sending Steve McIntyre the spreadsheet. It wasn't a spreadsheet at all, but he made it up. And Tim Osborne says he didn't confront Anne that I know of, but he says it wasn't an Excel spreadsheet. It was an FTP and ASCII file. He says, I don't know where Michael Mann's saying this. So people knew he was lying through his teeth, but they didn't approach him. Some people stayed away from Michael Mann with a 10-foot pole. They didn't want to get into any discussions because they knew they were going to be attacked. In fact, I don't know of any of his colleagues, co-authors, that Michael Mann did not attack personally in one way or another at some time. I was reading, it was either Bradley or Hughes, reading an email the other day, and he says, I know, to Michael Mann, he goes, I know you're mad as hell at me, and then he tries to explain what he did. I wasn't attacking your work. I was looking at this other work that had nothing to do with yours. And that was the type of guy Michael Mann was. He was shoot first. If there's anything left, shoot him again, shoot him again, shoot him again. There's nothing left.
And they also talked about gaming the peer review system, right? That getting rid of troublesome editors also.
Yeah, there was one, his name was Sayers. I don't remember the journal he was with, but they said, we think he's in the skeptic camp. If we can find any documentation for this, let's go to AGU and get him out. Michael Mann, I just put an infographic today on Michael Mann. Michael Mann, he was asked by a journalist in Europe. She worked for the Wall Street Journal in Europe. And she was asked by him because he's been accused of being a gatekeeper, trying to silence other views. Well, he was the editor of a journal, and of course, he has a bias toward minimizing or removing the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age. There's nothing that's going to get through him because of his bias. So anyway, she asked him about that. This is her words to him in an email. Michael Mann, how do you respond to the critique that as a key part of the review processes of publications in the field of climate science, as something of a gatekeeper, that you have rejected and otherwise sought to suppress your work and contradicted your work? Michael Mann, I won't dignify that question with a response, other than to say it betrays a deep naivety about the peer review process in science works, and it buys into what I consider to be a rather offensive conspiracy theories that impugn the integrity of editors, reviewers in general, and myself in particular. But a few years before that, Soon paper came out. Harvard astrophysicists came out. They got published. So Michael Mann had conniptions. He goes, I think we have to stop considering climate research as a legitimate peer-reviewed journal. Perhaps we should encourage our colleagues in the climate research community to no longer submit to or cite papers in this journal. We would also need to consider what we tell at the request of our more reasonable colleagues who are currently on the editorial board. The pressure was put on the people at Climate Research Journal was so heavy, they had 6 editors leave because one paper got published. Hans von Storch, he was one of the ones that said, it's not worth it, I'm out of here. I'm not going to take that abuse. So 6 journal editors left because one skeptic paper got published. That's the type of pressure they put on anybody that did not toe the line. Michael Mann called it, they're not supporting the cause, which he used against Judith Curry. I don't know what she's doing. It's not helping the cause. Like, they have an agenda, and they don't care what gets in the way. They're going over it, and they're mowing down everything that's in the way. While the ClimateGate emails showed what they were doing and exposed it to the world.
A very good analysis. What do you think is happening now behind the scenes? Do you have any ideas what's going on now with the adjusting of the data? Can you tell it all from the outside? It's pretty hard to tell when we can't read their emails now, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, just what the emails that I've had with NOAA, and I've emailed them too, but with the hiatus buster. And then they reverse those changes 2 years later. You know, they're still playing shenanigans. They can do whatever they want. Yeah. I wrote NOAA and I asked them about Tom Carl's statement in 1989. It says the the climate cooled from 1921 to 1979. So I asked him, I says, do you have anything from that era, any pamphlets, documents, any graphs from that, we can validate that? And they go, we don't have it anymore, it's gone. We just have the updated stuff. Like, they destroy the history. And then they use the plausible deniability. We don't have it anymore. We've updated it, it's gone, we can't get it back.
You must be a fan, though, of Tony Heller's work when he's looking at these adjustments and looking at even like old newspaper clippings, things like that.
Yeah, used his newspaper clippings, but instead of using them, because everybody knows they come from his site, I would go and find the original, download it, and copy it, and make the quotes. That way they can't relate it to Tony Heller. It's the same information, but it's from the source. It doesn't come from a climate skeptic that they will discount out of hand.
Is your plan now in upcoming years to keep working through the Dawn Twitter account, or do you have any other plans to make your work public any other place?
No, I've thought about putting together some books on it, on each of the main characters on it, but it's just, there's so much information in the 15,000 emails, it would take 5 lifetimes to just do Michael Mann. You can't describe what he did in a chapter or two. Like it would take a book to do it. And he's mentioned in so many of the emails, you have to go through them, put them in chronological order, and it's just mind-numbing. But he does make a fool of himself. He was against the hiatus before he was for it, and then he was against it again later. He just threw his name on any paper that was going. He says, yep, take me in it, I'm in it. In fact, there was one paper he was co-author in, and his name was way down the author list. And in that peer-reviewed paper, they put it as kind of the contribution, the level of contribution. He was way at the end, near the end. And he goes, I think I did more than that. He says, why am I so far down? And then he put a sad face behind it. He wanted to be bumped up higher in the author list because he thought his stuff was more important.
That sounds like him. So
Coding.
I want to get a handle on how many hours you put in. You said you put in maybe 8 to 10 hours a day reading ClimateGate emails for a while, right? A while back, or?
Yeah, I had a full-time job,
Yeah.
but there was a lot of free time in it. It's on call, on demand, according to a schedule.
Okay.
And if I had 2-3 hours downtime, I'd start reading emails. And it was constant. At night, I'd read emails. In the daytime, when I had spare time, I'd read emails. I was probably doing more reading emails than I was eating and sleeping.
And for a long time, right? Yeah.
Oh, for months.
Yeah.
Absolute months. I wanted to get through all of them. Probably 75, 80% might be pretty boring, really nothing to do. But the other 15, 20, 25% would blow your mind. Anybody that had an objective point of view.
Okay. And how about nowadays? Are you still spending a lot of time just looking around at new climate stories and new claims and things like that?
I kind of stopped for the last year or so reading up on Katharine Hayhoe, Michael Mann's interviews and things like that. I've got enough information from the ClimateGate emails, reading the blogs like, what's the one by alarmists started in Europe, Climate. If they wanted to come up with something different to argue against a skeptics paper, they would go to that website and put all the information on there. And there's about 5 or 6 of them. It was co-founded by Michael Mann.
A Real Climate, you mean, or?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, okay.
And you can see the links that Phil Jones, when he was discussing things with people that asked him questions, he'd lay out 8 links to that blog. That's how they'd answer. Or he'd go read the IPCC. I'm not bothering with you. Read 30,000, 50,000 pages of the IPCC to find out what was going on.
Okay.
They didn't tolerate questions. None of them.
I think Gavin, at some point, maybe in the ClimateGate email, said that he was going to make the data available in as impenetrable as possible format. Another question is, are you a student of John Cook at all? Have you looked into his work much?
As skeptical science?
Yeah.
Yeah, he blocked me because it didn't take very long. But I was reading some skeptic stuff, and they put out the information on his 97% consensus. I found his database. They never include the database in his paper. So nobody asked for the data, but somebody found it. An internet sleuth found it and put it online. So I was reading through that, and it was pretty funny. But the categorization, they were trying to use things on Mars, how they could relate to global warming on Earth. But the most interesting thing was they've included the forum of discussion that went into before that paper was written. They had a private, they thought was private, discussion forum going back and forth, and they're coming up with ideas. They started ideas for their PR campaign before anybody read any abstract. They were always going, all right, we need to get some names of journalists. We got to get some websites going. We got to plan the PR for this 97% consensus. And they would use people from the blog, no credentials whatsoever, reading abstracts and then trying to make a decision themselves whether it was for global warming or whether it was against it, things like that. And one of the carrots that they put out, the rewards like John Cook put out, was for them. They would become a co-author if they analyzed 2,000 abstracts. They could have been a dog catcher, a babysitter, anything. If they read and analyzed 2,000, they could be a co-author in this paper that didn't have any database attached to it.
That's pretty fun.
And they also had the Nazi pictures. They were really proud of the people had photoshopped them into Nazi uniforms because Skeptical Science had the SS. And so they took that, and they were actually really proud of the being photoshopped into Nazi uniforms until somebody found it, called them on it, then all of a sudden it was gone. But that information is still available on sites.
Okay.
And it was thoroughly embarrassing, but they were thrilled that people were making them appear to be Nazis because that's what they are. And one thing about Skeptical Science, I came across a skeptic who's a brainiac. I won't mention his name, but he found an article by Naomi Oreskes, who was probably the first one that did the climate consensus.
Yes.
And anyway, she wrote a paper. It's not dated, but it was from her days of University of California, San Diego, that was talking about the cooling through the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Skeptical Science used to have that on their website, but when they found that it was inconvenient to their agenda, it was gone. But he had a copy of it, and he sent me a copy of it. And I've posted that. It's a 4-page article plus references, and whenever I post it, I CC in her Twitter account. She's never discussed anything, but and then she's gone to the extent of saying that the cooling error wasn't real. And I go, yeah, it was. You said it was. What are you talking about? Like, they deny history, they delete it, they burn it, they chop it off, and then they pretend it never happened. And then they just keep with the same topic, the propaganda and the talking points of the current day, even though their own history shows that they're lying. They don't care. They don't think anybody's noticing. They don't think anybody's seen it. Gavin Schmidt, he was in an online, it was kind of a back and forth with a statistician. And Gavin would make a comment, and then the statistician would give his perspective. And I would take the statistician's word over a mathematician.
Right.
They deal with statistics, how to evaluate statistics. In fact, that's one of the things that the review into Mann's work, a formal U.S. review, is that he didn't have a grasp of statistics. He knew an algorithm, he knew adjust the algorithm, but he didn't know statistics.
Right.
He put too much confidence in his own work. But this statistician was back and forth. And then Gavin Schmidt made one extremely important statement, and it was the 95% confidence level. He said it's very likely just to be an imaginary comfort level. So he didn't put any faith in the 95% confidence level. It's just imaginary being comfortable. And they use that 95% or 90% confidence level as if it actually means something. It doesn't. They just throw it on to try to convince people that what they're saying is pretty confident. I can sell you a lottery ticket, say, I'm 95% confident you're going to win. It's like,
Right, that's
what
everywhere
they're doing.
in the IPCC report, right? That's everywhere, those confidence levels, and we're supposed to think that
Yeah.
they calculated that, and that means something, and again, it's just made up, I think. Yeah.
It's completely
Yeah.
made up, and it's done by consensus. Who votes as to what confidence level this is? And they go, yeah, cheers. In fact, sometimes in the IPCs, they said, we've got a really high confidence level on this, but we don't have enough peer-reviewed papers. Let's go find some peer-reviewed papers so we can make this confidence level seem more realistic. That's not science. That's circus.
Do you have other points you'd like to make before we wrap up this episode?
Thunberg. She came out with the climate strike. It was supposed to be spontaneous. Everything happened just off the cuff. But I decided to do research into her. I had no idea who she was. I heard about the climate strike, and then I started to read up about her. I wasn't just reading mainstream media. I was trying to find information from Sweden. I was trying to find information from the United Kingdom. And I found an interesting interview, a YouTube interview from Swedish TV channel 5. They were a documentary channel, reality, docudramas, things like that. They weren't into the normal programming. Her parents approached that channel when she was 12 or 13 years old and tried to sell her as for an 8-episode series. I don't know whether it was on climate or environment at the time. Yeah. And she's 12 or 13 years old. This was 2 years before the climate strike started. They tried to pawn her off at that time. The TV station said, we're not interested. And then in early 2018, there was a group, they wanted fresh new faces put together. So they ended up talking to a newspaper, and they had a contest, essays on climate, and Greta was one of those that put in an essay. She finished in second place. That was in May. Also in May, her mother was at a climate symposium with Ingemar Renshag.
Ah, okay.
He's the guy that started We Don't Have Time, and he had training from Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. So that started meshing together. She met him, he had met Al Gore, and they had worked together on PR, how to make money from the green energy scam. PR, working with companies like that. So that's how they're related. There was a guy named Bo Thorin, very wealthy person, worked in investment firms and that. And he was the one that called the winners and offered them to come to a meeting. And he said at the meeting, Greta was there. And he said, what we'd like to do, because of the Parkland shooting, they went on a strike. He says, we want to do something like that, a climate strike. So it was his idea. Apparently nobody ran with it, but Greta went back and maybe talked with her mom and father about it. And they figured they were going to do it. So it wasn't on her own. She didn't come up with this idea herself. And then things developed. They had brochures printed out for that day. But this had been a couple of years in the making, probably around the same time that the TV station was discussed regarding docudrama about Greta. The mother started writing a book. So the week of when the school protest, the climate strike happened, by the way, her Twitter account was set up a month before. So this was not spontaneous at all. The book was published and in stores 4 days after the strike started. You can't publish it, find a publishing company, edit it, go through all the edits, come back, have it printed, published, and ready to go in the bookstore in 2 or 3 days.
Right.
It takes a year or 2 or 3 to do that. So this was all in the background, going on in place, and they pretended this all happened. One of the people involved at the beginning was Ingemar Renshag. Yes. With Climate Reality Project, and We Don't Have Time. Greta joined up with a youth council and put her name on the youth council, and so he started publicizing it. He had walked by her climate strike because he got an email the week before from Bo Thorin saying that this is going to take place, it's going to be at the Parliament buildings, go there, bring a photographer. So he brought a photographer. He pretended that it was all off the cuff. He accidentally was walking by and he saw that. He accidentally had a photographer with him. But there's emails between them that showed that this wasn't true. He got information from it a week before. So he made the preparations tofu there, and then he started blogging about it, putting on social media. One of the groups that was in his name was Anders Wilkman. He's with the Club of Rome. He was one of the people behind this climate convention that they had gotten together, and they put a letter out and published the letter. 5 of them were from this group. Very wealthy people, green investment groups, and he used to be co-president of the Club of Rome. So he's tied into that. And then Greta, I'm not sure exactly how it happened. I have my suspicions as to how it happened. But she pretended to get offended that We Don't Have Time was using her name for publicity.
Okay.
And she wasn't involved in it, even though she signed up for the Youth Council and willingly a member of it. So she jumped ship from that to Bill and Melinda Gates' One Foundation. They took her over, and she became her handler was, what was her name?
Neubauer?
Yes,
Yeah,
Neubauer,
yeah.
A Rothschild heir.
Okay.
Filthy rich. She had volunteered or was paid by one Bill Gates Society Foundation, or volunteering for it, doesn't matter. That's how Greta got related to Bill and Melinda Gates. And of course, George Soros is on that board of directors too, and he's involved in that. So there's huge money involved in behind the scenes of Greta. This was years in the making, and it's all to promote green investment firms and green investment. They're millionaires, billionaires making billions off this. It's not for the climate. It's money. It's all about the money.
That's very interesting background. I did not know some of this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, they're all green energy venture capitalists. Filthy rich. They're not making enough money doing what they're doing, so they're using Greta to make money. But fortunately, COVID came around, and it took all the oxygen away from Greta. She's doing whatever she can to try to prime that interest up again, pretending she had COVID, and she healed herself at home. She never tested positive for COVID.
Right.
But she said she had it because that was the thing at the time. Get involved with COVID. Yeah, I had COVID. And then now she's, to get her name in the news again, she's suing Sweden for not meeting climate targets. They're a filthy rich family. There's pictures of her with her mother sitting on $20,000 chairs.
I saw that, yeah.
They're not poor people. They're not hard done by.
Very interesting. Do you have any final thoughts on where the climate debate is going? Any predictions at all?
Everybody's going full steam ahead with Agenda 35. Our Prime Minister is already cutting fertilizer for the farmers.
Yes.
He's made it 2035, everything's going to be electric. He's going to outlaw gasoline. They're going to start with social ratings, and you're going to be able to buy and stuff that you want. It's all coming down the pipe. Fortunately, I'm 60-some years old. I'm not going to be there like the 20-year-olds are going to have to suffer. But yeah, it's coming. Every nation is doing. California's gone 2030. The U.S. said they're going to go 2030. They have no idea where the raw materials are going to come from. They can't supply.
Right.
2% of the vehicles in the U.S. are EVs. To make it 100%, even not replacing any batteries, they need a 5,000% increase in material. Where's it going to come from?
Nobody has thought that through.
No, I've been reading some people who've done analysis on it. They're going to run out of material within 10 years. So we're going to be left just like the WEF wants it. Nobody's going to own any private cars. They'll all be jointly owned. We're not going to have no privacy. That's coming. And we're going to be happy. We're going to be eating bugs for dinner.
On that note, anything else, or should we wrap up this one?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot for doing this. I really enjoyed this. You're a very interesting guy, extremely knowledgeable. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm available anytime.
Okay. Let's do it again. Dale Johnson. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.